Jazzcast Pros.
If you find yourself always giving, grinding, and going, but rarely slowing down for you, this episode is your wake-up call, because the way you treat your sleep is the way you treat yourself. In this episode of the Doze Podcast, we're rewriting the narrative around self-care and looking at sleep as an act of self-worth, not just a wellness tip. If you've ever felt guilty for resting or struggled to prioritize yourself, you're going to want to tune in, because it's time to stop running on empty and start honoring what you need. In a world that never stops taking, sleep is how you give back to yourself. Welcome to the Doze Podcast, the podcast that is changing the cultural conversation around sleep. I'm your host, Soda Kachkowski. I'm a sleep health educator, certified sleep coach, and your biggest advocate for sleep as the form of resistance and renewal. In today's episode, I'm diving into something I talk about often in my coaching, my programs, and even in my own personal journey, the idea that sleep is self-worth. Now, I want to ask you something. How well do you sleep when you feel good about yourself? And how good do you feel when you're sleeping well? This is not a coincidence. Research shows that people with higher self-esteem and self-compassion are more likely to maintain consistent quality sleep. In fact, a 2022 study published in Behavioral Sleep Medicine found that people who report higher self-worth tend to fall asleep faster, sleep longer, and wake up less frequently through the night. Because sleep is not just a biological need, it's a reflection of how much space you give yourself to be cared for, to be restored, and to be well. So let's talk about how to stop seeing rest as optional and start embracing it as a daily act of self-respect that it is. So how do we honor our sleep and ourselves? Well, the first thing is to reframe rest as receiving, not quitting. Sleep is not a shutdown. It's a return to balance, to energy, to you. And yet 70% of women report feeling guilty for resting even when they're exhausted. I want you to just sit for a second and let that sink in. Guilty for taking care of themselves. But the truth is, receiving rest is not quitting. It's claiming what is already yours. I want you to stop seeing rest as what happens when you've done enough to earn it. Instead, I want you to ask yourself, what would I change if I received sleep as something I'm worthy of, no matter what I did today? I want you to try this. Before bed, I want you to write down one thing that you're letting go of and one thing that you're allowing in. And I want you to say out loud. I want you to create a bedtime mantra. I'm worthy of rest, even if I didn't get it all done today. Second, I want you to build a sleep shelf, not a sleep checklist. I want you to ditch the pressure of perfect routines. Your bedtime routine should be comfort, not a command. And a sleep shelf is a physical or mental space filled with supportive tools that you can choose from depending on what it is that you need that day. When your bedtime routine becomes just another performance, it often loses its power. Studies show that even small rituals tied to intention, like using essential oils or stretching, can signal to the brain to wind down faster and reduce bedtime anxiety by up to 30%. So tonight, I want you to create a visible shelf or tray with 3 to 5 soothing options. In there, you can have your magnesium topical spray, perhaps an herbal tea, a journal, or maybe even a playlist. And I want you to rotate it based on your mood. No rules, just rituals. Third, I want you to think about taking micro rests to reinforce your worth during the day. In a world that values output over well-being, rest becomes a radical act. Even a 5-minute break throughout the day can reset your entire nervous system and improve executive functioning, making your brain more resilient and less reactive. So you don't need to wait for bedtime to validate your need for rest. You can take just these short periods, these micro rests of 2 to 5 minutes, these pauses throughout the day to check in with yourself emotionally, physically, and mentally. You can do this by setting an alarm, every couple of hours, say every 3 hours. It simply says, pause and receive. And in that time frame, I want you to breathe deeply. I want you to open your posture, stand up, maybe put your hand on your heart and remind yourself, you're not a machine. You're a human being who deserves peace. And last, I want you to let your sleep space mirror your self-worth. If your bedroom is your recharge station, does it look and feel like a place where someone values sleep? You often heard me talk about setting up your sleep space for sleep success. I want you to ask yourself, would someone I love feel safe, soothed, and seen in this space? If not, start with you. People who associate their sleep space with comfort and peace are 40% more likely to report higher sleep satisfaction, regardless of how many hours that they get. You deserve a space that reflects care, not chaos. So I want you to invest time, not just money, into upgrading your sleep space. Clear your nightstand, add one texture that you love, whether it be a blanket, a silk pillowcase, or a favorite scent. I want you to make it yours and make it sacred. I want this to be the reminder for you. Sleep is not a luxury. Sleep is not a reward. It's a reflection of your worth. And you are allowed to be tired, you're allowed to rest, and you're absolutely allowed to feel good. According to the American Psychological Association, chronic sleep deprivation leads to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout, particularly among women juggling caregiving, work, and invisible labor. So no, this is not just about getting 8 hours. It is about healing the relationship that you have with sleep itself. So tonight, when you settle into bed, I don't want you to ask yourself, did I earn this? Instead, I want you to remind yourself that you are already enough to receive it. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone else who needs permission to pause. Think about leaving a review or tagging us on Instagram at thedoze.co or at Start With Sleep. And remember, your best days begin with your best nights. Until next time, sleep well.